Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC week number 6 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. We're really wrapping up the regular season at this point. By the end of today, we're already going to know a couple of teams that have qualified for the playoffs and some that have qualified for top 4 already for upper bracket. We'll obviously go over kind of the discussions around, who needs to get what result in order to get where as we get closer and closer to the end of the regular season. But I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. Again, if my voice sounds a little bit different, I am in my new apartment now. I have moved, and so hopefully the audio quality should be a bit better in terms of the room and the setup that we're in right now. It's definitely a little bit more secure than what we had previously, so let me know any ways I could improve it down below. But without further ado, let's get into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 in terms of where I think these teams are going, but with playoffs so close, it's now or never for a lot of these teams in terms of their performances, so I'm definitely going to be on the lookout for who's hot and who is not right now, regardless of whether or not I believe them to be stronger or weaker on paper. But most of today will be spent talking about those 6 best of 3s that we got, so let's get into day number 1. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. We're a minute and a half in. Let's get into the first series, which was a pretty good one here on day number 1. It was a matchup between Fnatic and Team BDS, and Fnatic is going to pick up the 2-0 win, and, as much as I can sit here and be like, oh, it was a 2-0, obviously it's really nice for Fnatic, and it's big that they were able to pick that up. This was not a dominant blowout series by any stretch of the imagination. This was still a decent look from BDS. I think that they had quite a few things going for them across this series. Game number 2 really wasn't all that bad from them, outside of not being able to play through the Nocturne Orianna combo nearly as well as they probably should have. They had a really strong bot laner throughout both games and just weren't really able to come through. I think BDS honestly played fine here, specifically in comparison to some of their performances the previous week. I had moved them out of my top 6 last week because it just didn't really feel like they were, playing the way that they should, but this is a top 6 team on paper. They've just not really been able to get there, and it's getting very, very late. As much as I'd like to sit here and say that, I'm not worried because they're not really all that bad. Like, losing to Fnatic in this fashion is really not that bad of a loss. It's getting a little bit too little too late in terms of their record. And for Fnatic, I moved them back into the top 2 last week because G2 has just been such a train wreck over the past couple of weeks, but that doesn't mean I have all of my fears dissuaded from them either. I still have a lot of concerns when it comes to their gameplay. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is an absolute no-brainer. It's going to go to Upset in the bot lane, not only for game 1, but for game 2 as well. Both games he just absolutely took over in the back half. The first one, it makes a lot of sense because he's on Kai'Sa and the entire comp is really built around Kai'Sa being able to dominate in the later part of the game. But on Kalista in game number 2, for him to be by far the most relevant player in that game, it's just super impressive. Clearly what, Upset is doing here on Fnatic is opening up his skill set to be whatever the team needs at whatever given moment. His KDAs have been phenomenal because he doesn't really make mistakes on this team. That being said, he's not always the main character. In fact, I believe this is his first player of the series of the entire spring split up until this point, which again, looking at stats, you wouldn't necessarily feel that is the case, but this team kind of focuses their priorities elsewhere and then relies on Upset to be that fail-safe in the back half of games, and he is very happy to live up to that role and to be somebody that can be very valuable in that role. So very easy choice for player of the series. This is one of the best AD carry, 2-game sets that I've seen in a while. Ice on the other side was also really good for BDS, and he definitely stepped up and played pretty well in this series. It's just unfortunate because Upset was just a little bit better. I also do want to point out Oscar Rinnan, credit to him for playing the Gragas in game number 2. That's going to be a big topic of conversation. Obviously, rest in peace to Shushei. He was a true, legend of early League of Legends, and I know it's a funny sentence, but, I remember a ton of memories from Shushei. A lot of people know the skin in the game because it's becoming free, and obviously, it gets played here by Oscar Rinnan. A lot of teams really stepping up and showcasing that over the course of this past week in a very respectful way, but let's remember what he did to get that skin. He's got one of the biggest, body slam plays in the history of League of Legends, and so it's not like Shushei is a player that we should forget, and I think, shout out to Oscar Rinnan and shout out to Fnatic for pulling out this and pulling out the Fnatic Fnatic, Gragas skin really to just kind of show that off. But Oscar also played really well. Again, I feel like that's a weird transition. It's always hard to go from such a serious subject to anything else, but, we got to get back into the conversation. A lot's been said about Shushei, and all of it is fantastic and true. But we're going to go ahead and talk about the games now. Oscar and him was great. Gwen, Gragas, both of those games were really excellent. Irrelevant hasn't exactly been the biggest competition in the entire world, but Oscar still did a fantastic job to be able to generate some advantages. Big credit to Razork. I don't think he's going to get nearly enough credit for how important he was in this series, especially in game number 2. 113 was not nearly as good. We talked about the Nocturne Orianna really not working on the other side of this for BDS. Part of that was, Razork being super aggressive and not really letting Nocturne have a lot of these, like, free choice situations where he can kind of move around and play where he wants to. A lot of the fights were taken on Fnatic's terms, and that's kind of against what, Nocturne, Orianna, Shen really want to do as a comp. So credit to Razork there. I thought he had a really nice mentality in this series. Humanoid has always owned Nuke in terms of how this matchup goes. Historically, Nuke has really, struggled, we'll just say, against the upper tier mid laners in the LEC. That's been getting a lot better as of late. We already saw him take down Caps earlier on this regular season. Unfortunately, he can't do the same for Huma. And then Mickey was also really solid, was great last week as well. But Upset really was like the hard carry of the team. And I'm not going to say they would have lost or anything without him, but it certainly would have been a lot more up in the air without Upset playing as well as he did. And then for BDS on the other side, it's unfortunate because, like I said, I do think that they actually had a lot of things going for them in this series. They just weren't able to get all of them in one game. I think most of the great performances happened in game number 1. Love how Nuke played that game on Tristana, and Ice was in a really good spot on the Jhin, just not good enough to actually be able to take the game. And then in game number 2, they indexed really heavily into this Nocturne Orianna comp to be able to dive with Shen and with Alistar, and, Varus can kind of follow up on that. Unfortunately, the middle of the map just lost, and they never really had the pressure they were looking for. Nuke is going to get dud of the series for me, mostly for this Orianna game. Again, he was pretty good on the Tristana in game number 1, maybe a bit over-eager, but he was pretty awful in game 2 on Orianna, and if that's going to be the case, especially in a series that felt super tight like this, like, that's dud of the series worthy. I don't think anybody else on this team necessarily deserved it, and so I had to give it to someone, and it unfortunately had to go to Nuke. 113 was in the conversation for me, but I don't think he was nearly as bad in that second and final game. Irrelevant ended up getting really outplayed on the top side, but he had a pretty good game on the Shen, all things considered. The Rumble was definitely worse, and then Ice and Paris were really good in this series. Paris' scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that, but he set up Ice really well, and the bot laner is starting to get into form for BDS, but like I said, it might be too little too late when it comes to this team. You're a little out of your depth at this point. You don't really control your own destiny. Only 1 week remains for BDS, and they are out of the top 6 right now. If this org misses playoffs, that's going to be a massive disappointment, not only after last year, but after what this org has become over the past couple of years. And for Fnatic, obviously, this is a really nice win. You're happy to be able to pick this up. 2-0 is great, and, regular season Fnatic is fantastic, but again, really at this point, all we're waiting for from Fnatic is what we're going to see in the best of 5 stage, because that's really what's going to determine who they are. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and a predictable outcome here. We saw Corp taking on Rogue, and Corp is going to pick up the 2-0. If series number 1, Fnatic and BDS, if that was a 2-0 that didn't really feel like a 2-0, it felt a lot closer. This was exactly what was advertised. They got absolutely demolished. I really don't think there's any other way to look at it. Rogue, that is, got absolutely demolished. It was not even remotely close. This was an absolute stomp in favor of KC, especially game number 2, so we're not going to spend as much time going over this, but I do think there are a couple of narratives that I want to address. First off, with Corp and this big win, we can talk about all of the players that ended up playing really well, except for Kana. Let's not talk about Kana. Adam's really, really, really good on the other side, and trust me, I'm going to have a hot take when it comes to Adam, because this series kind of brings up the point of, like, is he the best top laner in Europe and just stuck on Rogue? Like, is that where we're at this point? Obviously, I'm not going to go quite that far, but it's certainly a conversation. But everybody else on Corp was incredible, specifically the trio of Yike, Vladi, and Targamas, who I thought were all absolutely ridiculous in this series, all played out of their minds. I'm giving player of the series to Yike because I do think he was the most consistent across both games, but I think when you're looking at game number 2, you're probably looking at Vladi as like the primary damage carry and the big flashy player, and then Targamas really as the setup for that entire game on the Alistar, one of the best Alistar games we've seen. I just want to give Yike some credit for that Lilia game in game number 1 that I think was also really important. And Malrang obviously had no chance of being able to go up against Yike and actually, hold his own, because as we've seen throughout the year with Malrang, he just doesn't really have the mentality or the skill set right now to be able to deal with a lot of the top tier junglers in the league. And so Yike kind of had free reign in the early game to do whatever he wanted, and he generated some pretty massive leads for his team. Credit to him, especially, like I said, for that Lilia game in game number 1. The Vi was still really good, but I think this is more of a player of the series award than it is like a player of game number 2 award, because player of the game in game 2 would have gone to either Vladi or Targamas, in my opinion. Both of them really stood out. Vladi was excellent on Akali. I love that people are calling him Baby Zeka. I think that's a really funny, way to describe what he is as a player, and I honestly don't entirely disagree with that assessment. I think that he is obviously, similar in terms of champion pool. He's much better on these melee assassins, things like Yone, Akali, like Silas, that kind of champion pool. We've seen a lot of players come up through the ranks, even someone like Certus in the past couple of years here in the LEC, but the reason I think Vladi specifically kind of falls into that Baby Zeka category is because I think what he does really well is not overextend in mid-game situations that he doesn't need to. He understands the exact limits of where he's supposed to be at any given time, and the big thing for Zeka is not that he pops off on a lot of these melee carries, it's that he doesn't make mistakes throughout the mid-game, and he's not giving over free resources, he's not overextending in order to get plays on these melee assassins. That's what makes Zeka a little bit different on those champions, and I think Vladi definitely has a lot of that in him, so credit to Vladi. I thought he was great here. Targamas was unbelievable on Alistar. You can't give this guy Alistar. I think at this point it's just kind of proven that he is way too good at that champion. Not that he can't play everything else, right? The Poppy was awesome in game 1. We've seen what he can do on champions like Rel in that same vein, but the Alistar is uniquely incredible for Targamas, and I think at this point it's kind of a permaban against K-Corp if you're asking me. Everybody else on the team, I guess, was fine. Like, Kaliste was fine. Certainly wasn't the standout player, but didn't really need to be. Everybody else was kind of taking over in this series. And then, like I said, Kana was probably the weaker of these two top laners, but everybody's been losing to Adam as of late, so how much can you really put up to that? But KC is a really great team. I moved them up to number 1 in my power rankings last week because G2 was really struggling, and certainly nothing in this series to dissuade that thought. And then for Rogue on the other side, we're just gonna say it, man. Adam's unbelievable. Like, there's just nothing else to learn at this point. He tried to 1v9 in game number 1 on the Aatrox, couldn't do it, and so he tried to 2v9 with Yorick getting mated out on the Rift in game number 2. Didn't quite dominate in the same kind of way. There were still moments that were positive overall for KC into the Yorick, more so than into the Aatrox, but dude, if Adam was on like a legitimate team, if he was on BDS, just as an example, can you possibly imagine that? BDS Adam, jokes aside, like if he was on a team of that caliber that's good, but maybe needs that, top laner to really push them over the top, I actually think we'd be looking at him as the number 1 top laner in Europe because of the way that he's played over the course of this split. It really has been that good. And trust me, I've been on the Adam train for a long time. I've actually gotten a ton of criticism in my comment section for keeping Adam in my top 2, top 3 top lane rankings every single split, despite what happens off the Rift and just generally the perception of him. I don't think there are players at this position in this region that take over the game consistently in the way that he does. I just feel bad because he's stuck on the worst team in the league, or at least a team that would easily be the worst team in the league without him. I think outside of that, bot lane was horrendous in this series. Execute is going to be a lot of people's choices for dud of the series because of the KDA. I'm giving it to Patrick because of that Kai'Sa game in game number 2. I think one thing to take away, first off, this is Patrick's first dud of the series for me in the spring split. He got it almost every single series, every single game in the winter split, and so I'm certainly not trying to sit here and tell you that Patrick's had a good year, but he's definitely been better in spring than he was in winter. Also, I see a lot of people kind of confused as to why Patrick still has a job on Rogue. It's super simple. This team is not paying a 6th player. They can barely pay the 5 players they have on their roster. If they cut Patrick and bring in a new AD carry, they still have to pay Patrick. Like, it doesn't change the equation there. And so, that's why Patrick is still here. That's why all of the players who are underperforming are still here. Rogue is reportedly getting bought out as soon as possible by Na'Vi. Hopefully that happens before the summer split. That would be awesome if we got like a whole new roster coming in, a whole new organization. But this team is just kind of doomed, and this is the first time this split, at least, where it felt like Patrick was playing like the winter version of himself again. Execute was awful. Like I said, we'll talk about him a bit more maybe next week because there's some news coming out about a potential suspension for him because of some behavioral conduct stuff. So again, we'll talk about that maybe next week if that becomes relevant. But Larson continues to just not really be a factor. Malrang has done nothing of positive influence, even if he hasn't been the most negative jungler in the world over the course of this split. It's just awful for Rogue. No real positive takeaways here. And K-Corp's way too good to ever end up falling to a team like this, especially when Yike and Vladi in the middle of the map are playing like this. Targamas really stepping up, even with Kana maybe not being quite as strong as Adam on the other side of it in this series in particular. Still plenty to like for K-Corp. But then moving on now to day number 2, our middle day here in the LEC, and we kick day 2 off with a matchup between GIANTX and Team BDS, and GIANTX is going to pick up the 2-0 win, and they look really, really good in this series. It's really weird. I've been going back and forth on GIANTX throughout basically the entire split up until this point, where sometimes they look really good, and I think they had a pretty good winter split, all things considered. I think they got 5th. Technically, they were the best team outside of the top 4 in the winter split, but everything kind of fell off the rails at the start of spring here. Lot and Isma in particular on the top side just were not playing well. Jackies has really regressed in terms of what he has been recently, although he wasn't very good spring of last year either. Maybe it's just a spring thing for him. We'll see as we continue to go throughout the year, but through it all, I've been standing by the performance of this bot lane. There have been some up and down performances, but for the most part, Noah and Jun have been really, really solid for this team, and they continue to really push them over the top. I'm not trying to sit here and say that they were the only good players once again in this series, but GX definitely has a core, and I think they have players that can build around if they really want to. And for BDS, it sucks to go 0-2 in such an important week. Losing earlier on made a lot of sense. You had a really tough matchup and you just weren't able to overcome it. Losing here to GIANTX, that's not, it's not good enough. Like, these are the games that you have to win if you want to try and make the playoffs. This could be the series that determines whether or not BDS is a playoff team versus not a playoff team, and you just did not step up here today when it mattered the most. So that is a bit frustrating if you are a BDS fan, but let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series is very obviously going to go to Noah in the bot lane. Not only for all the stuff he did on the Rift and the way he ended up playing out a lot of these games and, you know, a lot of the end team fights throughout this series on both the Varus and the Lucian in game number 2, but obviously the off the Rift stuff. He was very emotional post-series. There was a lot of stuff that happened in family during the week, and, you know, I give him my condolences, but Noah still showed up on the day and still performed at an incredibly high level. For somebody to be able to, you know, go through so much in their personal life on that given day and still be able to dominate a game like this up against a player in Ice who really is finding his form right now, regardless of if the rest of the team is following up on it. It's really, really impressive stuff. So credit to Noah. I thought he did really well in this series. I do also want to give a lot of credit to Jackies. We're seeing the Akali pop up more and more in the LEC right now, which I think is an interesting turn of events. I'm not trying to say that that indicates anything, but it's kind of funny. I'm going to give the opposite advice for LEC mid laners than what I gave to like LPL mid laners, where in the LPL we've been talking about a lot of these older heads, players like Rookie in particular, falling back into playing Orianna and Azir every single game, kind of like Nuke did on the other side of this, and finding a ton of success, not overcomplicating the problem. I think it's the opposite here in the LEC. These are young kids that want to be really aggressive. Let them be unlocked more so with things like the Akali, the Aurora, the, you know, even Sylas, right? Like these mid lane mages, Yone can kind of fit, not mages, and the anti-mid lane mages, the mid lane assassins, these melee carries that you can really take over the game on. I love Talia, I love Orianna, I love Azir, and I still think they can be very valuable, but I think the pace of this league is just so different than it is to the Eastern leagues that maybe you do need to start stepping up and playing some more aggressive mid laners in order to succeed at a higher level. So credit to Jackies. I thought he was good here. Jun is always good. You know, I've been singing this guy's praises ever since basically the end of spring last year. I was a super hater at the beginning of 2024, and he has completely turned me around. I'm in love with this game now, so definitely some character development there. Lot was pretty solid on the top side. Isma had his best series by far as a member of GX, completely out jungling 113 on the other side, who, again, I want to reiterate, has been pretty good for BDS. He was not good at all this week when they really needed him the most. He's been very inconsistent, but for the most part, his spring has been much better than his winter. I think people are going to forget that because of how bad the end of spring ends up looking here, but overall, a great showing from GX. Really not a lot to complain about and a lot to like. And for BDS on the other side, they still come so close, and yet they're just so far away. Ice is playing so well down in the bot lane right now. This feels like 2024 Ice. I was starting to get concerned because, quite frankly, his form in winter, bad. Like, he was not a good AD carry. I think I put him all the way down at number 8 in terms of my rankings, or somewhere around there heading into this split, just because AD carry is already such a congested position in the LEC. If you're not going to be performing right now, you're probably going to be a bottom 3 guy, because there are 6 or 7 AD carries that are all average to above average right now in the LEC. So Ice needed to really step up this split, and I think he did exactly that, at least at the end. It just didn't really matter. BDS wasn't able to play around the hyper carry Zeri in the same way they were able to last split. Their comp is just a bit too slow, and they got outpaced in the early game, and a lot of that is 113 just not playing well enough, and he's going to get dud of the series for me. And he did not have a good week. Getting out jungled by Isma is pretty unacceptable. Again, this is the matchup that BDS really needed to win, and this is a jungle matchup that is very very winnable for 113 as a player. He needed to take a lot of that momentum that he had been generating over the past couple of weeks and actually use it, and he just didn't really do that. Irrelevant continues to be a complete non-factor. Actually, no, he is a factor, just in a negative way on the top side. Getting gapped by Lot in the form that he's in is not particularly good. Nuke had his worst week of the entire year, and Paris, you know, he was fine. I think he had a couple of good engages. He might get a little bit more blame than maybe he deserves. The bot lane in general was pretty positive, and again, Ice was carrying for BDS, but it felt more like a 1v9 than anything else, and BDS now is in a really horrible spot. You're probably looking at a team that's a lot closer to being bottom 3 than they are to being in the playoffs, and with this roster, with the talent of Nuke and Ice and a player like Irrelevant that you're spending a lot of money on, like, it's not acceptable, and with the expectations, they need to change something going into the summer split. And then for GIANTX, this is the kind of opening they need to potentially get back into the playoff picture. It's still an uphill climb for them. They're certainly not, you know, close by any means, but if a lot of the other teams mess up, if Vitality and Heretics really aren't as consistent as maybe we think they are, GX could be the team on the outside that could swoop in and take that spot instead. Then moving on to our second series here, and it is a rebound series of sort, a get well series. It's G2 Esports taking on Team Vitality, and G2 is going to pick up the 2-0 win. They really needed this after last week, everything just kind of going catastrophically wrong for them. In week number 5, it felt like they couldn't really find any sort of stability, so much so that even I, who have been defending them, saying like, oh, regular season form doesn't matter, and they're going to figure things out once we get into the best of 5s, even I was like, I'm a little concerned here going into week number 6 that this is a top team, because their issues were pretty deep-rooted, but once again, they end up figuring it out. I will say, though, a lot of the series isn't so much G2 being super dominant and unbelievably strong. It's more so Vitality just looking completely inept on the other side of this matchup, easily the worst that they've looked, and we've talked about it. We know that they're overperforming their talent level, in my opinion, with how things have gone. Like, this is a top 5 team right now in the LEC, and I just don't think they ever felt like a top 5 team, but this was a catastrophically bad performance from them, and I think a lot of this series has more to do with their failures than it does with G2's successes, and so I'm not entirely off the back of G2 just yet. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Skewmond in the jungle. He was pretty solid here. I do see some conversations. Again, we always talk about Skewmond and Lebrov first and foremost, and trust me, this series is not going to be any different, but this time it's in a positive light. But Skewmond is still a player that I think is a lot more inconsistent than he gets credit for. He's certainly not a finished product. I've heard a lot of people talking about Skewmond as if he's the guy for this team, and I understand. I think in terms of their wins, he is the guy for the team. You can basically look at every single series that they've won and point to Skewmond as the main reason why they've been able to pick it up. I just think that there are some underlying inconsistencies in some of the losses that might make it a bit tougher to go up against the junglers that are experienced at a top level, players like Yike that are able to, you know, really take advantage of those weaknesses in big best of 5s. We saw that in the finals, and I think we will continue to see that as we move forward. And then, of course, I really want to point out Lebrov in the support position. This was a fantastic performance from him. Gigantic support gap in this series. We'll talk about Niski on the other side, but Lebrov's not going to get nearly enough credit for his, I guess, micro is probably the way to put it, on the Renata here in game number 2. He did a great job of playing the map and playing the lane phase. I think his mid games are starting to get a lot more like they were last year on BDS rather than what they've been at the beginning of the year. I think for him, it's all just about feeling comfortable. He is an incredibly smart player. His macro and his team fight instincts in particular have always been the things that have carried him to the top of a lot of people's leaderboards, and he's not really gotten a chance to showcase that a lot this year. I think Hansama has definitely, you know, played a part into that, because Hansama really is a lane dominant player at his core, and he wants to try to play fast in the 2v2, and that's just not Lebrov. That's not where he's found any success over the course of his career, but I do want to say that I think he is starting to get back into the zone of being able to play out 2v2s if given the opportunity. Specifically, we saw that here with the Varus going into the Jhin and the Renata going into the Nautilus. So Skewmond and Lebrov kind of dominating conversations for G2 as they normally do, but this time in a positive way. I think everything else was really solid here. We already kind of mentioned Hansama doing really well to get an advantage in the 2v2, but Caps and Broken Blade I think were really solid. Broken Blade just abused Knock-Knocko on the top side, especially in that second game on the Jax going into the Aatrox. That matchup was not even remotely close. It's pretty funny to talk about, but overall just a really stable, really strong win for G2, and like I said, they really needed this after last week. It felt like they couldn't find any consistency at all, so to have a dominant win over a team that is probably a playoff team, it's just a good look overall for them. And then for Vitality on the other side, Like we already talked about, I think there are two players to talk about in a negative light here, Nako and Nisqy. They are really the two that I think stood out in a majorly negative way. I'm giving dud of the series to Nisqy, even though Nako was horrendous in game number 2. I mean, unplayable in that second game on Aatrox. I think Nisqy was somehow even worse, and I think at this point, it's fair to say that the Nisqy support experiment is failing, that this team has gotten worse since letting go of Hylissang. You know, I said that in the offseason, that Hilly was, yes, a big reason for a lot of their losses, especially in the best of fives down the stretch of that season when they were in the playoffs, but he was also the reason for most of their wins, and I get that players like Chayak and Linsas and Karzi have stepped up, even Nako at times have stepped up across this split, but I think without Hylissang's, consistent engaged presence and a lot of his aggressiveness, I just don't really expect this team to be able to generate all that much pressure on the map, and we're seeing that with Nisqy, who is already shown to be awful in the 2v2. He just doesn't really understand how a lot of these lanes go. Now, part of that you can excuse on the fact that he hasn't played support for all that long, and he doesn't really understand the small intricacies of those matchups, but part of that is just him not being a particularly good laner, and he hasn't been even in the mid lane in a lot of these instances, and so that is a bit concerning. But when he's going out on the map and just dying left and right and getting caught out over and over again because he doesn't know timers and doesn't know how to play against Labrov, that is incredibly concerning. So Nisqy is a very easy choice for dead of the series. It's nice for Labrov to get back on track, but against Nisqy kind of feels like a cheap win at this point. I will say though, one thing I want to add on Nisqy before we end up jumping off of this subject, I've seen a lot of people saying he's by far the worst support in the league. Loopy would like a word with that, and I know people are like, oh, Loopy's better than Nisqy. I think that's copium. I think people would want to hate Nisqy in that instance because Loopy is definitely still worse than Nisqy. At least Nisqy has flashes of good plays, which Loopy just doesn't do, but Nisqy is definitely right down there for one of the worst supports in the league. Nako, of course, the other player to talk about here, he got decimated in this series by Broken Blade and just by all the pressure that was put into the top side by Skumond and by G2 in general. I'm not blaming him entirely. He's a feast or famine player, but there's been a lot more famine in the spring split. It feels like his strategy is starting to get caught on by a lot of the other teams here. Karzi wasn't really able to do anything because his support was running it down. Somehow, some way, Vitality have turned Karzi into a martyr on this channel. I didn't think that that was ever going to be possible with how much I've, kind of been against Karzi throughout a lot of his career, at least recently. Linsas is still a jungler I don't believe in at a super top level, and Chayak is a good player, but certainly not good enough to be the #1 option on a playoff team. Vitality still really scares me. The middle of the LEC just is not very good, in my opinion. Maybe this team is a lot lower than we were thinking. There's a team like Team Heretics that probably has looked better as of late, but I trust that roster even less than I trust Vitality. It's just kind of a shit show right now in the middle of the LEC, but G2 is capitalizing on that and picking up a much-needed victory. It's really nice to see Skumon continue to step up in their wins, but it's all going to be about how he looks in their losses that determines how well this team is going to do moving forward. But then moving on to our third and final day of the week now, and we kicked off day number 3 with the matchup between Team Heretics and Fnatic. The Fnatic is going to pick up the 2-0 win, and this is probably the most dominant series of the week up until this point. If it wasn't for Oscar Renan, I would feel much more confident in saying that, but Oscar, of course, had to go out there and just have one of the worst Gwen games we've seen in quite a while. Didn't really end up mattering, and he still was very relevant down the stretch there. He still was very strong in a lot of these fights, but it is kind of funny to say that everybody else in Fnatic really starting to step up, starting to get a bit more consistent, and there Oscar is playing what might be his worst series of the entire split with how good he's been so far in 2025. But for Heretics on the other side, this is much more of the expected result. Some ups and some downs. I think that there are some good things to talk about in game number 1. You had an Azir that was pretty strong, and you put a lot of resources into him, and he just couldn't really do much in the late game. Not entirely the player's fault, just more so the circumstance. And then in game number 2, everything kind of went wrong for the team, and they certainly didn't have any pressure. So we'll talk about that as we continue to go along. But starting with Fnatic, player of the series for me, once again, is very obviously going to go to Upset in the bot lane. What a week for Upset. Really re-emerging as an MVP guy at the start of this year. He has been for the entire year. Up until this point, we talked about that pretty extensively in the winter split. I don't think he's been quite as eye-catching so far in summer. I think part of that is the pessimism that I've just naturally associated with Fnatic so far in 2025 because of the lack of results that they've been able to put out. They were so good in the regular season. In winter, and once again, they're just not able to overcome themselves, and they end up finishing 3rd in the playoffs. it's been hard for me to imagine that they're going to be entirely different going into the spring split here. And so there's been this, like I said, air of pessimism just kind of surrounding Fnatic and what their chances are moving forward. But you can't discount what Upset has been to this team over the course of this entire year. He's gone from being a pretty inconsistent AD carry that is really good in team fights, but doesn't get the resources from his team that he needs to be able to take over like he was on Corp last year, to a player that is very clearly, in my opinion, the best AD carry in the region. Kalist is the only other player right now who I think has a, argument to be made to be in that upper tier alongside him. People love Hansama. I just don't think Hansama is in that conversation. Upset and Kalist are the two best AD carries in Europe, and I think Upset has a strong case to be number one in that regard, especially with how he has played over the course of this week, whether it be the Kai'Sa game or the Ezreal game. Both were complete pop-off performances, were very main character energy type of performances, and you do want to give him a lot of credit for that. The other player that you got to shout out, mikyx, in the support position. Not that I've been, lacking on shouting Mickey out. We talk about the odd even thing with Mickey a lot, but it really is true. It's an odd year, which means that Mickey is in MVP form. That's just how things go for him in terms of his career arc, but it's cool to see him continue to, kind of really carry a lot of these games, be the number one guy for Fnatic. I think he's been the best player on this team across this year. When you look at the full year combined, I think Razork has an argument there, but he was really bad in the playoffs. I think Upset has an argument, but sometimes he's more of a KDA monster than he is somebody that's actually taking over games. mikyx, I feel like, has been super influential to what Fnatic is doing, but to me, it's not even really an argument right now. This is the best bot lane in Europe. As long as they're able to actually show up when it matters the most in the best of fives, I'm really not going to be concerned about this team all that much moving forward. Razork had another really good series, and it's worth noting Sheo has been awesome for Team Heretics on the other side. I would actually argue that Sheo has been one of the best junglers in the entire league so far in 2025. So for Razork to just have way too much pressure in this series is really positive. Sheo playing more facilitator, Sejuani, Maokai, the things you would expect, and then Razork, of course, pulling out the Dr. Mundo jungle, which has been very successful globally. Basically, every time we're seeing this, we are seeing it dominate, whether it be here or in Tier 2 when we talk about that on this channel. So Razork kind of identifying that can be a pretty strong pick and making the use of it, good use of it. Humanoid as well in the mid lane, he was fine. Kamalu was probably better in game number 1, although it's kind of up for debate, but Kamalu was so miserably awful in game number 2, and we are going to get to that on the Mel in just a moment. Oscar Rinnan actually was in the running for dud of the series here, if you want to believe that. He still was way too relevant at the end of game number 2 for that to ever be the case, but he kind of got bodied early on at the beginning of that second game. So overall for Fnatic, it's kind of the win that you would expect. It's pretty clean macro-wise. They're able to get a big lead through their hyper carry in the bot lane, and they're able to translate that. But at the end of the day, it's still so hard to be excited about this team when you know that the inevitable collapse is going to come in at some point. And for Heretics, this is more of an expected result. Again, we talked about Vitality kind of crashing back down to earth. Heretics is also a team that I think is overperforming the talent. They are overperforming the talent on their team, and I think a lot of that has been Sheo being awesome, Flacket and Stend being a lot better as a bot lane duo, and Carlson really stepping up in the top lane. But notice the name I didn't mention there, and that's going to be Kamalu in the mid lane, who is going to get dud of the series yet again. I believe he has the most of anybody outside of Patrick in the LEC for me this year in terms of dud of the series, and it's unfortunate because I think when you look at game number 1, you're like, well, he was the only one with any gold in that game, and it's a pretty difficult game to win on Azir when you're already super far behind, when everybody else on the team is losing, and that's not obviously ideal, but you can't be picking Mel on this patch. I'm sorry, it's just not socially acceptable for Mel to be in the game right now. She's just way too weak in terms of where her numbers are at after the initial nerfs, when she really was dominating pro play for a little bit of time. Not dominating, I was always anti-Mel, but especially now, that kid is not useful unless she's absolutely killing people as quickly as possible, and she just can't do it. Kamalu looked useless, and that was a big reason why they ended up losing game number 2. They had no pressure through the middle of the map, and this is just kind of the thing with Heretics. Kamalu is a very feast or famine player, and right now there's just more famine than there is feasting, and that's just a bad place for a team that wants to try to make playoffs to be. They have not secured their spot by any stretch of the imagination. GIANTX, BDS, these are teams that are absolutely on the outside looking in, but very much are knocking on the door at the current moment, and you've got to start stepping up. That being said, it's not like everybody else on the team was particularly consistent. I considered Stend for dead of the series here because Mickey pretty thoroughly outplayed him, although I'm not really blaming Stend for that. It was more so just circumstance. Flacket was definitely worse than Upset on the other side, but again, Flacket wasn't necessarily bad. It's just that Upset was really good. Sheo got out jungled. Carlson was pretty good across the series. I would say Carlson was probably the player that impressed me the most for Heretics, and that's kind of been a recurring trend for the team, which is really fun, but overall, they just didn't have the firepower to actually be able to win here. And then for Fnatic, it's a nice win. Like, you're happy to be able to pick it up, but it's not really changing my opinion or my idea of where this team is at. Beating Heretics should be a no-brainer for Fnatic, especially in the regular season. It is nice to see Upset and Mickey in particular, though, getting into form where they can really dominate the league again. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in week number 6, and we thought the first series of the final day was a blowout. Here you go, it's Movistar KOI taking on SK Gaming, and of course KOI is going to pick up the 2-0 win. That was expected with these two teams. KOI is pretty good at beating the bottom tier teams. They just struggle to actually break through into that upper echelon. At least they had before a couple of weeks ago, but things are starting to get a bit better for this team, and I'm really excited to talk about it again. I'm just very interested in the direction that they're going to go. One of the big reasons that I've continued to criticize KOI is because they are pretty one-dimensional in terms of how they win games, and I hate to say it, it didn't exactly come from a different way than how they have won normally. It's not like, you know, somebody other than JoJo Pune is stepping up and actually carrying games, and it's not like they've proven that if JoJo plays bad, they can still go out there and win games, but it's still a win, and a win nonetheless, because this was dominant. And SK, man, we thought like Vitality or Heretics had a couple of bad games earlier on this week. They got nothing on SK Gaming, who just got rolled in this series. I mean, it was all 5 members looking completely and utterly unplayable for them, and that's really just been kind of the crux of their entire season up until this point. They just don't have the firepower to be able to deal with anybody, and their wins, their upset wins from the beginning of the split, they are looking farther and farther away now than they ever have before. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series for me is going to go to JoJo Pune in the mid lane. He was definitely the main guy. I know it doesn't necessarily show up in the KDAs. You would look at Elyoya, you'd look at Mirwin, hell, even Supa and Alvaro. JoJo probably has the least impressive KDA on his own individual team, but when you actually go and watch the games, it's like, oh yeah, the Talia was pretty active in game number 1, really opened up the map for everything, and was definitely more of a macro presence than the Ryze was on the other side, which is always a positive. And then go watch the team fights at the end of game number 2. That Victor is decimating everything that SK wants to build, and it really is just an impressive showcase of what JoJo can look like at his absolute best. We know that things can go well for JoJo Pune. They've gone really well in North America. He's a former MVP winner over there, and we've seen the flashes, and he's getting into form right now. He's probably in the best form he's been in since he came over to Europe. I don't think he's played quite like this in the LEC so far this year, which is really nice to see. It's nice to see him, you know, really starting to step up when it matters the most. But the thing about MKOI that I get concerned about, I don't think I've ever called them MKOI. That's the first time. But the thing about Movistar KOI that kind of gets me a little bit concerned about them moving forward is just how reliant they are on JoJo Pune actually playing really well for the team and not running it down in the mid lane when he individually is such a volatile player. We've seen it pretty consistently. If this team is not winning through the middle of the map, they just can't win games. They have absolutely no backup option, and it's why I've been concerned about putting them into the top 3, because the top 3 teams have shown pretty consistently that they can at the very least neutralize the mid lane, and I don't think JoJo really has a good way to be able to react to that, and the rest of the team hasn't shown that they can carry games. Now, that being said, this was a very good performance across the board for Movistar KOI, but I think I would have been more impressed if JoJo somehow got absolutely gapped by Reeker and they were still able to come out on top in this series. That's kind of what I'm waiting for with KOI, because I just don't think that that's ever going to be the case, and I don't think you can rely on JoJo being good every single game. But again, like I said, he's getting into form right now. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he figures it out. Elyoya ends up going deathless in this series, going into Bukata. He plays Xin Zhao Poppy, doesn't die a single time. That's super impressive overall for him. He's definitely been in much better form, and I think a big reason for KOI's resurgence here has been Elyoya and JoJo finally getting on the same page, which felt, you know, basically impossible for a little bit of time there. It's really nice to see that Elyoya stopped being such a resource carry like he's always been in the jungle, because he realizes that JoJo really needs those resources in the mid lane. So, you know, they're just figuring out how to work together. Mirwin's been awesome this year, in my opinion, better than he was last year. Supa and Alvaro have been totally fine in the bot lane. Alvaro in particular has been really exceptional as a support, but Supa's been more of a background character, not in a good or a bad way, just he's a very talented player that is clearly not the guy that they want to give resources to on this team. They want to play through JoJo. They want to play through even Mirwin more so on the top side, and that's totally fine. Supa's very strong as a weak side bot laner. He's going to be fine in that role. So overall for KOI, it's a pretty good victory. Like 2-0 in a dominant fashion, it's great. It's just predictable. It's the way they've consistently been able to win. But talking about SK on the other side, we gotta start with Loopy. Like, there's just nowhere else to start in terms of this conversation. Loopy is so bad at support that he's basically given up the position and he started playing non-support champions. He was criticized for being the worst support in the league, so he role swapped to playing Annie and Gragas instead, and he still was completely garbage in this series. He is clearly done of the series. I get that people are gonna point at, like, GIANTX in the top lane or even Reeker in the mid lane for not being particularly good. Loopy was so much worse than everybody else on the Rift, and really everybody across this week in their one individual series, that there's nothing else left to say. This is the worst player in the LEC. I cannot even believe that there were conversations that a player like Niski is less valuable to his individual team than Loopy is. There is nobody in the league less valuable than Loopy. Like, he was bad when he was playing with an AD carry who handpicked him and who he had synergy with from a previous team. You take that out of the equation and you put Kadui in to play AD carry, this guy is unplayable. Like, there is no justification for him still to be the starting support. I don't imagine he will be going into the summer split. I would be very surprised if Loopy continued to be the starter here, because there's just nothing to build on if you're SK Gaming. I get that he probably signed a full year contract and it's probably hard to get out of that after only 2 splits, but you're never going to be able to win if he's your support. But maybe you're not going to be able to win with anybody else here. GIANTX ends up getting destroyed on the top side, one of his worst series in a while, and for him being the veteran on this team, that's not a great look. Bukata has really crashed back down to earth after what I would consider to be a pretty good start to the split. Kadui's kind of in a similar boat, although it's less his fault, I would say, than it is Bukata's. And then Reeker is always just a bad mid laner. He does not have the mechanics to be able to deal with a player like Jojo Pugh in 1v1 in lane. He has to hope and pray that the enemy makes a mistake, because his weakness is his hands, and you know, when they don't make mistakes, he's not able to make up for it with his smart macro plays. He's just way too far behind in gold in almost every single game. So for SK, they are pretty predictable in the place that they are in, and that is the worst team in the league. And for KOI, they're happy to take advantage of that. Like, this is a team that has been a little bit more on fire as of late, and that's obviously really good to see. But once again, I would just love to see this team start to play through somebody that isn't Jojo Pugh. And once I can see that they're not quite as one-dimensional as maybe I first thought, like, or I currently do think, then that's when I'm really going to start viewing them as contenders. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC week number 6 overview and analysis video in the spring split. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 6 weeks of action. Of course, we are really nearing the end right now. Happening live as this video is going up is going to be the start of week number 7. So we're really getting into the back end of things. That's the final week of the regular season before we jump in to the playoffs. And you can see that because we already have some teams that are guaranteeing their positions in the playoffs. So we can go ahead and go over it. Next to every team is, of course, my personal power ranking for that team from number 1 to number 10, kind of talking about where teams are moving up or moving down. But really not a lot of changes this week, not a lot of upsets this week to talk about, but some important standings things to talk about, like we said. Of course, top 4 in the playoffs go into upper bracket. Number 5 and number 6 end up going into lower bracket, and then bottom 4 are done for the split. They do not make playoffs, and so we can see some color coordinating going on. Fnatic and Corp with their records have both confirmed top 4 placements. That means they're guaranteed to be in the upper bracket somewhere. That's why that they are covered blue here. And then Movistar KOI has guaranteed themselves at the very least playoffs. No matter what happens, they will be in top 6, but they have not quite guaranteed top 4 like the other two, although it is very likely that they will get there. That being said, no changes at the top of the standings in terms of the power rankings. Number 1 is still going to be Corp, number 2 Fnatic, number 3 G2, and number 4 Movistar KOI. They still are leaps and bounds better than every other team in the league. It's a big 4 right now in the LEC, but nothing this week really led me to believe that I should change that. G2 still has the potential to go back up, but still need to see more after last week, even if they did look great against Vitality, who's not dropping from number 5, because Heretics as well was also pretty bad. The best team of the middle of the pack right now, at least in terms of how they played in week 6, was GIANTX, but I just don't trust them after how they have played for a majority of the split up until this point. So they are only moving up to number 7, but they will leapfrog the team that they beat in BDS, who falls all the way down to number 8. They were number 5 for a majority of this split in my power rankings. They couldn't quite hang on to that. They fall all the way down to number 8. This team is collapsing at the finish line, and it's really frustrating to see. Rogue and SK are still clearly the 2 worst teams in the league, so they stay in the bottom 2, but let me know what you agree with or disagree with in terms of those power rankings down below. Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions on that. But let's go ahead and move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 6. Player of the week was super easy. I did not have to think about this at all. It's going to go to Upset, the AD carry for Fnatic. I think if you picked anybody else, you're absolutely trolling. This was a one-man race the entirety of the week. Not only did Fnatic go a perfect 4-0 against BDS and Team Heretics, but Upset dominated all 4 of those games. The only unfortunate thing is that I could only put 3 of his dominant games here on the graphic itself. The Kalista game, the Kai'Sa game, and the Ezreal game were the 3 that I ended up choosing, but that first Kai'Sa game in the BDS series was also phenomenal. Upset's getting back into that form that he started off winter with, and that's really, really fun to watch. Some honorable mentions, as per usual here. Noah, the AD carry for GIANTX, the AD carry that Upset came in to replace on Fnatic. He was fantastic in his one series against BDS this week. With all of the adversity up against him, he still stepped up and was really strong for GX, and he has been throughout this entire year. He's been the rock alongside Jun for that GIANTX team, and he might be able to get them into playoffs, so he's going to get an honorable mention for me. And then Jojo Pune, the mid laner for Movistar KOI, they obliterated SK Gaming in the back half of the week in our final series of the week, and JoJo looked fantastic in that series. He's looked great in the past couple of weeks. It's nice to see him getting back into form, but he needs to maintain it because we know how important he is towards KOI's success. So JoJo and Noah are going to be my honorable mentions, but upsets player of the week, and then my dud of the week is going to be going to 113, the jungler for Team BDS. I considered somebody like Loopy or even someone like Niski for this, but with 113 playing so bad in 2 different series across this week, it actually felt like a pretty easy answer in the end. It really does feel like his performances are just so feast or famine, and a lot of them have been pretty famine. The good plays definitely are there, but so are the bad plays, and I think a lot of people are going to remember the bad plays, and especially down the stretch now when you're trying to fight for a playoff spot, when you're going up against a team in GIANTX that you absolutely need to be beating to establish positioning in the standings to really underperform in that series in particular, I think is really going to hit BDS fans pretty hard. So 113 is going to get my dud of the week, and upset is going to get my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to post about the rest of the LEC split, as we always do, but of course we cover all 3 of the other major regions as well, so LTA North, LCK, and LPL every single week, as well as Tier 2 over in North America, the NACL, every single week on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.